Okay, so here I'm going to talk about how to do a hex wheel conversion for the YZ10 Works series. So any of the 91, 92, or 93 Works YZ10s, this particular type of hex conversion should work. So if you go back in my video history, I did talk about a hex conversion for the 870C, and that's a lot more straightforward because you only need to buy, two different types of CVAs and, throw some hexes on and it works just fine. But for the YZ10s that have longer suspension arms, it's a lot more complicated because, at least for me, I have not yet been able to find a single CVA or CVD set that will work for the front or the rear. You actually have to use, one set of dog bones and one set of wheel axles and make it all work together. So it's actually kind of expensive, but in the long run, I hope it would be maybe less expensive than trying to source new original Yokomo universals, like, for example, say this guy right here, right? So these universals are very hard to find. So if you have a runner for one of your YZ10 Works and these universal joints wear out, then you have to find new ones. And they do exist from time to time on eBay or elsewhere, but they're very expensive. So at least if you can run modern parts on this, you can not only run modern wheels, which are more immediately available, but also the replacement parts themselves should be easier to get. Okay, so I'm first going to start with a few things that didn't work. When I measured out the universal joints for the front and rear of the Works, what I found was that in terms of the actual length of the dog bones, the Hot Body's D413 dog bones are the perfect length. The problem is the actual ends of the dog bones are too fat to fit inside the diff outdrive. Okay, so here's some money that just went right down the drain. Not a big deal as part of the learning process, but just so you know, just because you might find a dog bone that might be the right length, you also have to check the end of the dog bone for not only the circular sort of bulb part here, but also the dog bone pins. One or both of those might not slot correctly into the Yokomo YZ10 diff outdrive. Okay, so these were almost perfect, but not quite. The next thing I tried was the Tamiya DB01 front dog bone, okay, and the actual end of the dog bone almost fits perfectly in the diff outdrive. You just have to take the dog bone pins themselves and shave them down along the length direction a little bit. They're actually a little bit too long, so as the suspension compresses and the dog bone pins move in and out of the diff outdrive, they try to move past the wheel bearings. And because these pins are a little too long on the DB01 dog bone, they get stuck at the wheel bearings. You have to shave them down just enough so that they can slide in and out nicely into the diff outdrive and not get bound up by the presence of that diff bearing. But you don't want to shave them down so much so that they never actually get captured by the diff outdrive. Okay, so just do it iteratively and to make sure that everything works smoothly there, and that won't be a problem. However, oops, got a lot of stuff going on around here. The actual wheel axle itself is not from the DB01 front. So I think I have that here. Okay, so the DB01 front wheel axle is this guy. The problem is, if I place that appropriately, maybe a little hard to see, the hole where the drive pin goes is dangerously close to the outer wheel axle bearing here. So by the time you put the drive pin through that, there's almost no space for a shim to get in there. So basically, you just have to put the pin in and then put the wheel hex over it and tighten it down. But now the problem is, once you do that, the wheel hex itself is going to grind against the plastic housing here on the outside of this steering knuckle. It's because this hole here is too close to the outer wheel bearing. So you need to find a wheel axle that pushes this hole out a bit so that you don't have that binding issue. One thing you could do is use the rear wheel axle from the DB01. So you have the DB01 front dog bone and the DB01 rear wheel axle. Okay. And the dog bone length is, it's maybe a little on the long side, but at least it pushes this hole out, and you can, make up the slack between this hole and the steering knuckle with a bushing or, some shims or whatever. And then you put the wheel hex on. So this wheel hex does get pushed out a bit. I did something very similar for the rear as well. So it'll make the car a little wider. So you can try to find a wheel with, a shallower offset to compensate that, so that, the car is of the appropriate width. But at least, to make this a runner, maybe you don't care too much about, a couple millimeters here in width. So long as it's symmetric front and rear, it should be okay. So what I did here is, again, you can use either the DB01 front here. But what I ultimately used was a wheel axle, or sorry, this is DB01 rear wheel axle. I used a wheel axle from a Team C CVD kit, TS4031. So this is just a CVD kit that I thought would work on a 94 YZ10 hex conversion because it measured at 78 millimeters for the dog bone. But the problem is that 78 millimeters was not measured the way I expected it to be measured. So different manufacturers will measure the length of the dog bone differently. Some manufacturers, what they'll do is they'll measure from the actual end of the dog bone here to the actual end of the ball, on this side over here. What others will do is they'll measure from the center of this hole here to the center of the dog bone pin. So basically what I think happened here for the 78 millimeter unit, they were just not using the same reference points that I was using for the measurement. So that dog bone ended up being too long. So I couldn't use it for anything. But what was good about it was that the actual wheel axle has an indentation for a C-clip to go around it and capture the drive pin here that goes in the universal joint. So even though you can tighten it down with a grub screw here to lock down the wheel axle, sometimes on these types of universal assemblies, that grub screw can back out and this drive pin can fall out of the CVA, okay, or the CVD. CVAs and CVDs are basically the same thing. It's just a matter of whether, just for your own knowledge, whether the dog bone goes inside the wheel axle or whether the wheel axle goes inside the dog bone, okay? So, for example, on the rear here, I have a CVD. The wheel axle goes inside the dog bone. On the front, it's a CVA. The dog bone goes inside the wheel axle, okay? Just so you know. Or I think it's the other way around. Any case, this is what I did here for the front. So again, DB01 front universal dog bone. It's 78.5 millimeters. And this particular unit is from Yeah Racing. And either a DB01 rear or some kind of Team C Racing rear CVD wheel axle to make the front work. Okay, so this should be okay for the front. The only problem you might run into is that the actual diameter of the wheel axle itself, this part here, is a little on the large side, so it may end up rubbing against the inside of the steering knuckle housing. I haven't actually tried running this particular YZ10, but right now this is the best that I can get it to work at the front for any kind of hex conversion. Try it out if you want. Let me know if there's a problem with rubbing. Maybe, a quick fix to that would be to just shave out some of the inside of the actual steering knuckle housing just to make some more space there if you absolutely have to. Now on the rear, it got a little bit trickier. Finding the right dog bone wasn't quite so bad. It was a 73 millimeter dog bone that I needed. As you may know from the 870C hex conversion video, 73 millimeters is pretty easy to find by using the Kyosho Laser ZX5 FS2 SP front universal dog bone. Okay, so that's just the right length and it slots in just fine. You don't have to modify anything on the end of the dog bone for the ball part or the pins or anything. It fits just fine in the diff out drive. But now the trick is, once again, getting the wheel axle to work appropriately. So The first thing you'll notice is that I have a non-stock rear hub carrier. This rear hub carrier is an aluminum unit for the Laser ZX5. The stock rear hub carrier looks like this, and let's see. I ran into a similar problem as with the front, where basically the hub carrier itself was too fat for me to fit a wheel axle through and not have, you know, the whole mounting point here for the drive pin be too close to the outer bearing. So what I ended up doing is going to the ZX5 rear hub carrier. Part of the reason for that, if I remember correctly, it's actually been a while since I did this, was to push this actual universal joint in a little bit to make sure that at full rear droop, I didn't get the dog bone pulling out of the diff outdrive. Okay. The other reason for that, actually, I think that was the primary reason, and then I just compensated for the offset by using a long wheel axle here. So this wheel axle on the rear, because it's a CVA joint and not a CVD joint as with the front, I had to find a CVA wheel axle that is metric and could fit inside of this Kyosho unit. What I ended up finding was that the Losi 22 rear wheel axle is a near perfect fit. Again, you know, the hole for the actual drive pin mounts around here somewhere. You know, you use a bushing and a washer to pick up the slack, and this should work okay. The trick was getting the actual joint itself to work. So if I take a look at this guy here, so this is the original wheel axle for the Laser CVA here. Now, the problem, man, this is really fuzzy. Let me see if I can just zoom in a bit. Is that focusing? Not really. All right. Sorry about that. Basically, the actual pin, this pin here, right, that goes in the center of the joint, obviously is going to fit through the hole for the on the actual end of the dog bone itself. The problem is that this pin is actually too wide in diameter to fit through the little cylindrical piece that goes inside this dog bone, or sorry, inside this CV joint for the Losi part. So this Losi wheel axle comes with that little sort of, I forget what it's called, but basically it's that joint piece that goes on the inside that rotates here, right? The Losi part comes with its own version of that, and this pin is too thick to fit through it. So what I had to do was find a pin that was not only long enough to cover the full length or diameter of the outside part of this joint, which the Losi part is too short for that, okay? But it also had to be sort of narrow enough to fit through the Losi joint, but wide enough to not give too much slop between that and the actual Kyosho part. So what I ended up using was a team associated drive pin, not the factory team solid unit, but a stock unit that's sort of easy to bend or compress. It's hollow in the middle, and you really have to force it in there. So if you're going to use that associated piece, you're never going to get it back out. You're never going to be able to rebuild this. So if something wears out, you just have to throw it away and rebuild the whole thing all over again. Okay, but you have a Kyosho part here, an associated pin, and a Losi wheel axle, and you put this all together and it should work okay, right? A little bit of slop here at the universal joint, but otherwise it seems to work. So far at least, with the parts that presently exist on the market, this is what I had to do to make a working hex wheel conversion for a YZ10 Works buggy. Hopefully in the future, you know, some other manufacturers might come out with universals, you know, just from one manufacturer that will actually coincidentally fit this better. But this is what I had to do for the time being. It cost me a lot of money just to figure it out because I had to buy all these different parts and experiment a lot. But at the end, I ended up settling on this. So maybe it's not worth it in the end because you have to buy all these different parts from different manufacturers to get this to work. So ironically, you might be better off just trying to find more original universals that are no longer in production, or just run your YZ10 less often so that you don't wear those out so much. So I guess that's it for this particular video. If you have any questions, please post in the comments section, and thanks for watching.